Today I'm going to walk you through the process of taking your rough panels, your front, your two sides, and your back through the rough sanding process, and then we're going to process it and get it to a point where we can actually glue your box into an actual box. Your first step is to take all your panels out of clamps. I've done all of that off camera, and then I went over to the hand tool cabinet and I picked up a glue scraper. Your first step is to take all of your glue, little dried glue bits off of your joints. The backs should at this point be clean. If you glued it up like this in your clamps, the one thing that I ask you to do is to wipe all the glue off the joints so that when you put your tape across the diagonals, the tape doesn't get all boogered up with glue when the tape rolls back up inside of the housing. So at this point, your back should be okay. The fronts, however, do have glue that are little glue beads that are on the joints. This one isn't horrible. But I like to check it just in case. And then this one, a little bit right here. That one's good. Then just double check the back. Yep, that still has been in good shape. And then this one had some pretty good ones on it. You can see on this panel that I'm using a little bit of colored epoxy, just filling in the knots. And it looks like I need to do another application on this one. But I'm just going to keep going on this. And again, the back on this looks good, so I don't need to worry about that. Now this is the back that I just glued up, and you can see that the dried beads are just, in fact, they are just dried. I never wipe these off when they're wet because it actually creates more of a mess that you have to clean up. I'd rather just use the glue scraper to get all of the dried glue. It's a little bit more clean. Well, it's actually a lot more clean, and it's actually kind of fun too. When you're doing this, it's a really good idea to have your safety glasses on. When these things pop off, they come off at a very high rate of speed, and they can hurt an eyeball. I've had it happen a couple times. But it's just a really good idea when you're scraping any amount of glue off to have your glasses on, because again, this stuff can pop up in your face. It's actually hit me just around my mouth several times just with that one little swipe of the glue scraper. So be careful when you're doing this. Now if you look at this, there's a little bit of glue left right here along this joint. Don't worry about getting that glue off. All you're trying to do is get the stuff that is proud of the surface, anything that would prevent your panel from lying flat on the bench. Before it wobbled a lot because the glue on the two faces were uneven, and it's just something that you need to be aware of. You really just don't need to worry about getting all of this stuff out of the joints. This is caused by the board itself being uneven, and in that corner there's just a little bit of glue that builds up, and you can try and get it out. I'm not saying you don't, or I'm not saying you can't, I'm just saying you don't have to get that out. So if you did want to get it out, you would just use a corner, and that one doesn't look very good. Boy, the corners on this one just don't look good at all. So I'm going to try and get that out just so you can see what it looks like. And again, it's not all coming off. I really do need to sharpen these, but don't sweat getting everything off. You're just getting the majority of the glue off, just getting the big glue beads off of your panels. So these are ready to go over to the wide belt sander. When I come over here to the wide belt sander, I'm going to be doing all of the setup of the table, getting it all adjusted and set for you to be able to sand all of your parts, your sides, your front, and your back. There's just a lot of stuff going on with this control panel, so we've got to turn it on, get it set up. Now, before I fire this up, a couple things I'm going to need to do. I'll turn on the dust collector, but I want to cover a couple things before I go ahead and do that. When it comes to your panels, the thickness is very critical. What you're shooting for is a 13/16 thick panel. And when you measure, you don't want to measure with the tongue of the tape. At this point, I always bury the one, start at the 1-inch mark and measure from the one. When you're measuring with your tongue, it's not always 100% accurate. With a lot of tape measures, they're not. Especially after you've been using it for a while, when you drop it, if it were to land on the tongue, that's when the tape measure gets out of alignment and it's just inaccurate. So because of the necessity of how accurate we have to be with this, I'm just going to advise you, don't measure with the tongue of your tape. Bury the one, measure starting at the 1-inch mark and measure to that point. We are going to 13/16 and this is going to take several passes. How many passes, honestly, I don't know. I've never counted, and that's kind of the point. You don't want to rely on how many passes you take. You do it until you hit 13/16. It will depend on the material that you're using, whether it's a hardwood like the maple or a softwood like the alder. It's just going to depend greatly on what material you have. So I really can't give you a perfect number of this is how many passes. It's just going to depend on what lumber you're using on your project. So I'm going to start this, and okay, one other thing. When you are loading the machine, you need to make sure that when you load the material, especially the sides and the front, that the grain of the material, you want to push it or put the material in with the rails and the panel grain going in this direction. You don't ever want to put it in this direction because then you're going to be sanding across the panels and the rails, and that's the majority of the surface. If you put it in this direction, you're going to end up doing a lot more finish sanding later after your box is assembled. So just to avoid the extra sanding, I very highly recommend and advise you to just keep putting your panels, your sides and your front with the rails in the center panel with the grain going this direction. So I'm going to start by putting the sides in first. Always start with the smaller pieces first, and I'm going to stagger them kind of like a stair step. So I'm going to put them in the machine like this. I'm utilizing the entire width of the belt. So that is just one of the things that I do in order to wear out the belt uniformly, and I want to make sure that my back goes in last. And then the last thing that I need to advise you with is with your back, that should be the last piece when you put this in, and it's going to go kind of slow, but once the end of your back hits that red bar right here, at this point you should be very quickly going to the other side of the sander and picking up all of your parts. The main reason being is if you don't get around quickly to the other side, remember those small panels are first. If they were to fall off the table, they do have a tendency to break. It's not always possible to fix them, so it is just highly advisable. Once your last piece, your back should be the last piece, when the leading end of your back hits this red bar right here, that's the point where you very quickly run around to the back side of the sander and pick it up before everything, or before your first piece falls off the back. It can be bad. I have had, in the past, I have had to fix those, and it's not always repairable. Sometimes we have to completely just rip the frame off, and we can reuse the panel, but there's still a lot of work involved in redoing all of your, involved in redoing all of the frame. So just be aware of that. I'm going to fire up the dust collector, and I'll get going on this process. my 4th pass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the thickness of my panel. I'm seeing 7/8 with the tongue and 7/8 with the tongue there as well. So another thing that I need to point out is on the control panel with that switch right there, it's just above the emergency stop button. I need to click it. I'm clicking it to the right. It's just a really quick click, a really quick click with my wrist. I'm clicking it to the close side. When you're closing the table gap, you're making your panels thinner. So I'm just making a quick click with that switch, and then I take my panels and I flip them over every single pass. So you got to make sure that you are doing that every single time. I'm going to take that switch right there. I'm going to click it really quick, just a flick of my wrist, and then flip my panels every pass. I'm measuring again. Still need to keep going. As I continue to get closer, that looks perfect right there. As I continue to get closer, it is a good idea to check pretty much every pass just to make sure that you don't overshoot it. If you do make your panels too thin, that's really a bad thing, because when we go to cut the joints on the sides in order to put your box together, it won't come together using the shaper that I intend. So it's a lot more important at this point to get your thickness dead on. When you're done, you need to hit those 3 red buttons. That's an emergency stop button. The only time you ever hit that one is in an emergency. So if the machine is misbehaving, doing something that isn't normal, that's the only time you would hit that button. As long as you hit those 3 red buttons and turn those green lights off, that's all you're looking for. That light can stay on. Let it come to a stop, and then you can actually, as soon as you hit those 3 red buttons, you can go on and go on to the next step. The next step, after you do your rough sanding and take your panels down to 13/16 thick, is to start the squaring process. Our first step is with our sides. We are going to measure the width of the panels at the top and at the bottom, and we're looking for the smallest measurement that we get. Most of the time they are a little bit uneven. Very rarely will they be uniform. So I'm just looking for my smallest measurement. It looks like I'm going to cut these down to 11 3/4. So I'm going to go over to the table saw, and I'm going to put these edges up against the fence, and I am going to trim off this edge right here. As you can see, this is the raw edge. Part of it got cut when I was processing them, but for the most part, these just need to be trimmed off. If you look at this side is nice and clean and jointed, but this opposite side is not. So this is the side that I need to focus on trimming off, so my good clean edges go up against the fence. At this point, it's just going to be a call that you're going to need to make which edge goes up against the fence of the table saw. And what I would recommend is that you put an X on the sides that you want put up against the fence. That way you know which ones you don't have to second guess when you go over there and miscut. So at this point, put X's on these edges so you know that they are the ones that need to go up against the fence. So I'm going to go set up on the table saw right now, and I'm going to get these taken care of. Off camera, I went ahead and marked the edges that I want up against the fence with that X, and then I'm going to set my fence for 11 3/4, like I mentioned just a second ago. So lock it in at 11 3/4. and then turn it on and make your cuts. Again, just make sure that your X's are up against the fence. All right, at this point I have 2 parallel edges. Now, my next step is I'm going to go to the panel saw and I'm going to give my 3 panels, my front and my 2 sides, I'm going to give them just a little bit of a haircut, a little bit of a trim so that they are perfectly square to the edges. And again, I'm going to go over and do that over at the panel saw. So I'm going to go set up for that cut next. All right. I've got my panels. This is a process that I will be doing for you guys. This is a saw that you really need to understand before you actually use it. So I'm going to take care of this step for you. All I need you to give me are your 2 side panels and your front panel. I'm going to set them off to the side and cut them one at a time. And all I'm doing is I'm trimming off the top. I'm just giving it a little bit of a haircut so that it is perfectly square, and it'll get rid of some of that blowout that you guys have been experiencing. I've had a lot of questions, or I do get a lot of questions about that, about the blowout, and this is the reason why we don't need to worry about it, is because we're going to trim that top off. So when you look at these, the top edges should be nice and clean and even. There shouldn't be any glue or anything. They should be nice and perfectly clean. Our next step is to take all 4 panels and we're going to trim them all to the exact same length, or in this case, the width of your panels. So I'm going to set up on the table saw and walk you through the steps to accomplish that. I'm back at the table saw. I'm ready to cut all 4 panels to the exact same width, which in this case is going to be the height of your box. So with the previous 2 X's on the edges, I'm going to scratch those out because I don't want to get them confused with my next set of X's that I need to mark. My next set are going to be the tops, so the narrow side, the narrow rail is going to be the top. That's where I'm going to put an X on all 3 of my raised panels, my sides and my front. Now on my back, I got it out of clamps, I scraped it, we put it through the sander. At this point, what we need to do is we need to joint an edge. That's gonna be the edge that we put up against the fence of the table saw when we rip everything to the same uniform width. So I went ahead and I jointed this edge off camera, so I'm going to use my pencil and I'm going to incorporate that with the other X's, the other surfaces that I've cut on the panel saw. So I'm ready to go. I've got X's on all my edges that I'm going to reference off of the fence, and my next step is I need to determine how wide these panels are going to be. And the way that I determine that is I measure the length of all 6 of my stiles. So I'm going to measure the length of that stile, this stile, this stile, and then over here I'm going to measure the length of these 3 as well. What I'm doing is I'm looking for my narrowest, my smallest number that I'm going to be working with. Whatever that number is what I'm going to set my fence for, and then I will trim off the bottom, what will be the bottom of your sides, front, and your back. So I'm going to get my tape out and I'm going to measure all of them. Just under 12, 15 sixteenths, 15 sixteenths, 15, exactly 12, and exactly 12. So I'm going to set my fence for 11 and 15 sixteenths. And there we go, just like that. Now I can put my X's. My X's again are going to go up against the fence, and I will be trimming off the bottom. So I'm going to take care of that right now. That didn't quite take off as much as I wanted, so I scooted it over another 30 seconds. I want to try this again. That's more of what I'm looking for. Now the whole thing is clean. Now that all of my panels are all the exact same width, if you look at this, everything is uniform. My sides and my front are more or less done. The only thing that I need to do now is work with the rest of my back. Right now I have this back end is even with the front and the back. So notice that I need to trim my back to the same length as my front. The first step in order to achieve that is I'm going to go to the miter saw and I'm going to trim one end so it's perfectly square. And then I'm going to come back to the table saw and I'll cut the other end to make the back the same length as my front. So I'm going to go over to the miter saw and I'm going to all set up to do that next. Alright, I'm at the miter saw and I am ready to trim this end so it's perfectly square. The amount that I take off is really not that critical. What I do is I just, this hole that's in the throat plate, I just more or less just cover the entire thing from front to back. About right there. And then I always hold the panel down with the panel, the part of the panel that's up against the fence. I'm looking to make sure that my gap is completely closed between the material and the fence, because if you push right here up against the auxiliary fence, I have a gap along here. That is incredibly dangerous. You're going to have the shock and the surprise of your life the instant the blade hits the material. It's just going to shove it right up against there, and it is very audible. Anybody in the shop can hear that. So what I'm looking for is no gap where the material meets the fence, and I hold the material down on the table with my left hand, in this case my left hand. If you had the panel shifted to the other side, I would have my hand right here pushing it down on the deck of the saw. But I want to make sure that there's no gaps. And I'm covering the hole in the throat plate, and it's just a very slight trim. It's not taking off a whole lot of material. I want to take the saw out. I'm going to plunge it down, and then I'm going to slowly push it back so it gives me a nice, clean, square cut. I don't want to just rip right through it because it'll give me a really bad edge, or really bad end, excuse me. So I'm going to bring it out. I'm going to turn on the saw. I'll plunge down, and then I will slowly push back so it gives me a nice, clean cut. Okay, so it looks a little bit something like this. Make sure not to lift the saw until it's come to a complete stop. You don't know what's going to happen with this little piece with that saw spinning as you raise it up. So I always let the saw stop. And this is looking pretty good. Now I'm going to set up at the table saw once again, and I'm going to put this edge, or excuse me, this end up against the fence, and I'm going to trim this end to the same length as my back. So I'm going to set up over there now. I'm back here at the table saw, and I'm ready to cut my back to the same length as my front. Now, one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that your back can be a little bit different in its length from top to bottom. So I checked mine off camera, and when I measured here at the top and here at the bottom, it was about a 32nd of an inch off. Just having it off by that little bit can make a difference when you go to glue your box together. So at this point, I want you to measure the top and the bottom right along their edge and get those two measurements. If you notice that one is different than the other, take the small number and use that number to cut both pieces to the same length. And I am going to be cutting my front as well as my back, just to make sure that they are perfectly uniform. And this is a really important thing to remember. One thing that you also need to know is I need to put this side, this end, this style up against the fence, because when I put it on the panel saw to make my cut, to trim off my top, this is where I got my square cut from. That is a reference. So I have to work off of this edge in order to cut this to length. So I am going to be working with this one. I'm going to put it up against the fence. So I'm going to put it down just so I can keep track of it. And I don't necessarily, I really don't like having stuff over here. In fact, I am going to slide it over here out of the way. But I am going to keep track of where, what has been cut and what I need to reference. So this is the side that needs to go up against the fence. I'm going to make these cuts now. That's the end that I just cut on the miter saw, so that goes up against the fence as well. Let that blade come to a stop and then lift the guard up and take out your waste piece, and it is in the garbage can. So now, when I am done with this step, I'm going to check everything one more time, get them all put together. What I am looking for is this, and this is going to be something that you can do before you come to me and tell me that you're ready to do your shaping on your ends. I'm looking for everything to be perfectly even. I'm looking for the front and the back to be the exact same length, and I'm looking for your sides to be the exact same width in this case. And I'm just double checking to make sure that everything's square. This is something that you all can do before bringing your parts to me in order to be shaped. So at this point, you are ready for me to do the shaping.